Ragnar Rommetveit, Norwegian psychologist, very inspired by Wittgenstein, and well, he basically tried to combine ideas from Wittgenstein with a more psychological approach. And he wrote books where he tried to show what this combination would amount to. Malinowski, Bronislaw Malinowski. Remember we discussed the Polish nobleman? There's a Polish person in here, I remember. Not here today? Or, yes.
Yes, she is.
Yes, she is. Very good. And you remember we had this discussion about him?
Yes, I remember.
And his analysis of the fishing trip?
Yes.
Yeah, that's the same guy. So that was actually, in a sense, maybe the first activity-based communication analysis. Because he took the activity of fishing, going fishing together with a team of people, and then he tried to show how communication was used in order to do that successfully. Firth was this first professor of general linguistics in Britain, who had been working in the colonies in Burma, and came home with a lot of ideas about how we could study context. And for him, especially the context of culture was very important, and he wanted to put that into linguistic analysis. Finally on this list you see something called dialogue grammar. Well, this is maybe the least important on the list. This was important, let's say 20 years ago, when people were trying to formalize what happens in dialogue and write formal grammars that you could make a computer follow when you try to simulate human conversation with computers. That approach was fruitful at that time, but perhaps it's not so popular today. Today people are trying to do, well, things a little more advanced way than was possible, let's say 20, 25 years ago. Okay, anyway, this approach was formulated originally 20, 25 years ago, or even earlier. So that dialogue grammar had an influence on the way it was done. Okay. Now I want to compare this approach with some other approaches to language and communication that exist. So let's first start to look at, well, I don't know how many people here have studied linguistics? 1, 2, 3, 4, not very many. In linguistics, in the last 50 years, what has been very important and has had very high status is to write grammars of languages. Especially the work of Noam Chomsky has been behind that sort of approach. And in that approach, the practice of formalization has been important. So this theory, activity-based communication analysis, is a theory, but it does not stress grammar or formalization. It stresses, let's say, more substantial ideas about what happens when people communicate. But the focus is not on grammar and formalization. However, that doesn't mean that all work that has been done in linguistic theory are unimportant for this approach. It's the parts which, let's say, are less grammar-oriented, less formalization-oriented, are also parts or have been taken into account in this theory as well. Okay, so especially semantics and pragmatics have been important. You remember those three words, syntax, semantics, pragmatics. So syntax has been less important. But the nature of meaning, the nature of linguistic communicative interaction, the nature of linguistic action, communicative, all those things which have been very much discussed within pragmatics have also been very important in this approach. In general, in this approach we have a holistic approach to the understanding of production, language, and mechanisms of communicative interaction. Holistic means that we try to get a picture of both the speaker and the hearer and the interaction between them. So we're not only looking at single words or single sentences, which is what the practice has been to do in linguistics. So that sense, an approach of this type where you look at the interaction between speaker and hearer, the dialogue, the interaction, or has not been very common. It's not the common thing in linguistics. The common thing there is to focus on small parts of language, and if you're in the Chomskyan approach, then your special object of interest is always the sentence, and how a sentence is constructed, built up, etc. Okay, so some parts of linguistics will definitely be compatible with this approach, but other parts are perhaps of less interest. Now, if we compare it to some of the approaches which have been popular in the last 30 years, speech act theory is one of the approaches that has been very popular. Now you remember these are the names: Austin, Searle, Habermas, etc. One of the things which is wrong, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to point out some things I think are wrong with these approaches, and that's not what we're following then in activity-based communication analysis. So one of the things that usually has been the case in speech act theory is that they have been, it's a kind of written language perspective, you might say. They have been interested in a person speaking out into a vacuum, and the reaction of the other party has never really been of much interest. So it's a kind of one-way communication analysis. They have noticed that you can act when you speak, but less attention has been paid to the results of acting. So the comeback of the listener, you might say, is not really there. So it's not two-way interactive. Another thing is that in this approach there's no acceptance of Austin and Searle's suggestion that we should analyze communicative functions in terms of locutionary, illocutionary, and perilocutionary forces. I don't know, how many of you have ever heard of this? Nobody. Then don't worry about it. It's been very popular in the world of communication. If you have never heard of it, you don't need to hear about it again now. Okay, we also, one of the approaches that has been interesting then, or interesting for ACA, has been the approaches to trying to bring in rationality, Grice and Habermas. And as I told you when we went through that kind of theory, one of the criticisms against those approaches is that they bring in ethics implicitly. So they claim that it is not rational to lie. But I have always found it extremely hard to accept that idea. I think it can be very rational to lie, but it is not ethical. It's not, I mean, you can easily pursue a certain goal by lying. And it might even seem to you that this is the most efficient, and maybe it is the most efficient way to get to a particular goal. But it's not good, because you're fooling people. You're giving them false information. That means that they are less able to act in a way which is maybe beneficial for them. So it's unethical. Now, if you look at the frameworks of Grice and Habermas, they don't discuss ethics. So in this theory, that's one of the things that is discussed: ethics, communication ethics. And as a consequence of that, some of the maxims for conversation are different than those that were suggested by, for example, Paul Grice. So he had, if you remember, he had these maxims: quantity, quality, relation, and manner. In this approach, we have some different ones: pleasure and pain, etc. If you read this, you can see what we'll come to that. Now, another big topic that has been debated a lot in social science is whether we should have causal explanations or more intentionalistic explanations. Should we take an inside perspective and look at the purposes and intentions of people that we are studying? Or should we care less about that perspective? Should we care more about maybe some causal explanation of behavior that the people who we are studying don't really understand themselves? So this has been a traditional bone of contention in social science. So if you're a Marxist, you'll probably think that the intentions of the people you study are less important. At least Karl Marx thought so. He said that workers could be very happy toiling away and slaving for a capitalist, but they don't understand that they're being exploited. Only the Marxist theorist understands that, and he's right. So even if you ask these workers, are you happy, and they say yes, then you should not accept that. You should see the objective facts which show you that the worker is being exploited. Okay, that's taking a causal explanation outside of the intentions of those who are studying. Marx called what the workers had false consciousness. Okay, other people think that no, you cannot do it that way. You must only take into account what the people themselves think. You must have their inside perspective when you do social science. Okay, who's right? Anybody have an opinion? Nobody? Safest. Okay, I could also not make up my mind. So in this approach, we have both approaches, of course. We have both the causal and the intentionalistic. Because they both seem to be different circumstances. Some circumstances it's good to base your explanation on what people themselves intend and want to do. In other circumstances it's better to have some kind of causal theory. And they can be motivated in different contexts. Okay. So now let's compare ACA with CA, conversation analysis. And the first comparison is a kind of methods-based comparison. In conversation analysis, there is a kind of idea that we have a certain set of data. We have some audio recordings, or we have some video recordings. Then we have made a transcription or annotation of this data. And when we explain and describe what is going on in a conversation, we should stick to this data, and we should not go outside of it. So we should not interview people who are in our videos or audios and ask them, why were you doing this? What was the background of this? We should not do that. We should only stick to the data there. Okay? In this approach, that's not necessary. We are allowed to interview the people and ask them why they were doing what they were doing, and we can add that data to the data we observe in the transcriptions, annotations, or recordings. So that's a methodological difference. Okay, in the conversation analysis approach, several theoretical concepts have been proposed. Among them are things that you see there: turn, adjacency pair, preference orientation. I think I explained these to you when we had the other lecture on conversation theory. You're shaking your head, you don't remember them?
No, you didn't.
Do you remember preference orientation? I said if you get an invitation, what's most preferred? To accept or to say no?
No, you won't.
Now it's coming back to you.
No.
No? Is it coming back to anyone?
Yes.
Yeah. What were you doing then? Were you taking your lunch now? Okay. Right. But I did explain some of them. Preference orientation, I remember I explained. Let me see if I can say. Turn is turns at speaking. So I speak and now it's your turn. So that's the idea. Adjacency pair, Didn't we talk about this? Question, answer, greeting, greeting. Yeah, and my criticism was it's not only pairs, it could be triples, it could be more.
I guess it was the end of the lecture.
And you were already thinking about
Going now.
Okay, but anyway, you now that's coming back a little here. That's good. Okay, so these are concepts, and you've already heard some of my criticisms of this, right? Let me just take the turn concept. I think I didn't criticize that last time, so I'll criticize that now instead. So, so the simple idea is that when we talk to each other, we take turns in talking. You talk, I talk. And each such contribution to the conversation is called a turn. So one definition we could give of a turn is what is said by the speaker who holds the floor. Okay? So what happens then if I'm talking and the person I'm talking with says, while I am talking? What is that?
Feedback.
Yes, it's feedback, but in conversation analysis. Nothing. Nothing. Because it isn't a turn. That's a problem. So it's out of turn talk or something like that. So they have a problem with everything like that that goes on while the main speaker is speaking. So for reasons of this type, in ACA, we decided, no, let's not take turn as the basic concept. We decided instead to take utterance, or more generally, contribution. Okay, so if I am talking blah, 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 and you go, no problem, that's an utterance. Both are utterances. You might even say that I am the main speaker, the turn holder in the CA terminology. But the other person is still making an utterance, but doesn't have a turn. That you could say that. We have, sometimes we express the view we have in ACA like that. Okay, so, and why did we say, and we also decided that we needed a different word than utterance, because we wanted to cover also gestures. So if I'm talking and you go, that's also making a contribution to the conversation. And in CA, again, there's no real place for that. But in this ACA approach, where we're very interested in multimodal communication, that would be a contribution to the communication. And even more generally, we might say that in the conversation analysis tradition, they have a kind of telephone engineering perspective, just like in the Shannon and Weaver definition of communication. They sort of think, I talk, you talk, I talk, you talk. But this is not a correct picture of what goes on in human communication. So I'll take my friend here. I talk, you're looking at me, I'm looking at you. I'm looking at your reaction, so you're getting more and more interested. So, information is going between us all the time. It's not I talk, you talk. There's a flow between us. To some extent, this is mediated by your blinking, you're moving your arms, your little twitches here, etc. Okay, but that's all part of it. And that's, again, it's difficult to fit into this turn-taking model. Doesn't really, I mean, turn-taking model makes more sense if we're on the telephone, I talk, pop, 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 you come on. So there it works fine. And that actually was also the original inspiration of this theory. Telephone conversations. That's the original paper on turn-taking was based on that. Okay, so it's a slightly different perspective. However, we share in ACA with CA a deep conviction that we need to record people who are communicating, and we need to study that very closely. And I would say that in this respect, conversation analysis has been the most successful, let's say, approach to communication, because they have inspired very many people to, instead of, for example, using questionnaires or interviews with people about how they communicate, which is otherwise quite popular in communication studies, They said, no, that's not possible. We need to record them and see what's really going on. And in ACA, we share that idea with them. That's really, it's not sufficient just to do interviews or questionnaires, even worse. You never know what people report on questionnaires. Okay. Now we turn to another approach, critical discourse analysis, sometimes abbreviated CDA, critical discourse analysis, CDA. Well, the main focus of this approach is actually usually some kind of political critique. And the main question that people ask in this approach is usually, when they analyze things, they ask, in whose interest is this being said right now? And the perspective is usually that it's in the interest of the speaker. So you're trying to see the speaker as a representative of some interest. It could be a group of people, or it could be, well, earning money, getting power, something like that. And that's the main trick of this kind of analysis, is to show how you bend language in order to increase your own influence, your own power. And people who do this, they usually try to say that they are on the side of those who are oppressed. Let's hope they are. I think you could actually use it on the side of anyone to do this. One difference, I have nothing against this, and this could easily be made part of the ACA approach. This hasn't been, let's say, a main focus, but I'm nothing against these questions. I think they're very interesting, and I've sometimes also done studies with these questions, but they have perhaps not been the main focus of the ACA approach. The focus in the ACA has been more on interaction, more than on individual writing. And CDA, critical discourse analysis, has often been focused on writing. So you could have people writing newspaper articles or blogging, or they could have, sometimes they do transcripts from parliamentary debates. But usually they don't look at the interaction very much at all. They look at the kind of arguments, the kind of terms that are used, and how they promote particular interests. Okay, sometimes critical discourse analysis is connected with epistemological relativism. What does that mean? It means something like, what's true for you is not true for me. So, in ACA, we do not believe in this. We think what's true for you should also be true for me if it's really true. And therefore, we don't have an easy way out. So when we meet somebody who says, yeah, maybe that's true in your world, that's not the way we are allowed to speak. We live in the same world. We have to have arguments. It's like in rhetoric, classical rhetoric. Who is right? We have to have an argument. We cannot just sort of step back and say, maybe that's so in your world. We are in the same world, and we have to talk until we come to some kind of joint understanding of what's going on. Okay, but sometimes, I don't know, for some reason, there's no real reason for why critical discourse analysis has to be married to epistemological relativism. It doesn't. You can do it without that. But for some reason, a lot of people who are in that somehow collapse into epistemological relativism. Yeah. Okay, why activity? Well, the overriding answer is that social activities, and by that we mean such things as plowing the fields, going fishing like Malinowski, negotiating with somebody, debating, lecturing. Yeah, we have a long list of such activities. They are a natural mid-range organizational unit of social life. Mid-range. They're not the most macro unit, and they're not the most micro unit. They're sort of in the middle. And when we look at these social activities, we see that communication is usually the primary means of pursuing the activities. And here we have some more examples: conversation, travel agency, lovemaking, refugee processing, teaching, and you'll soon see we have film people and saved material of those films in a corpus that we have, where we have 30 different, at this time, about 30 different social activities. And then, of course, there are many more, and I haven't found a way of saying how we could create a complete list. I'm not sure that's possible, because we could always think of new activities, and we could give them a new name. So that's a problem with this notion. It's not. I mean, we can go into a particular society and we can ask people, what do you usually do here every week, every month, and we can get a list of what people so far usually do. But it's hard to get all small activities that some people might be doing, and it's impossible to, or at least extremely difficult to predict what will happen in the future. New activities could come up. Yeah?
What is the reason for the macro and micro activities cannot be counted as social activities?
The reason is that we have an analysis of social activity, which I'll soon present to you. And in that analysis, we will have a macro level as well, providing resources for the meso level in the form of kind of causal influences, like culture, let's say that. Sweden, but I don't forget which country you come from. Which country?
I'm Swedish.
Swedish, okay. So Sweden, when you speak probably, Swedish culture is going to influence the way you are. Okay, so that's fine in this model, but it's there, as we'll see, as an influence on what you do when you go into a travel agency, let's say. So it's going to be there, but it's going to be there, as you will soon see, as an influence on the meso range. What about the micro range? So that's when you go into the travel agency and you say, whatever you say, hey, and they say, hey. Now we're looking at the influence of the travel agency activity on micro events, such as in this case, what we call here what in CA is called adjacency, pair here is called exchange type. So greeting. Okay. So both of these things are there, but they're not the focus of this analysis. Yeah? Okay, another thing I want to say is that doing this kind of analysis allows both for a normative and a descriptive perspective. So it allows both for describing and trying to explain what happens when we communicate. But it also allows, once we have that description, we can sit down ourselves, or if we are consultants for a company where we're doing an activity analysis, we can show them the films of what they do, and they say, do you like this? And they say, we like some things and we don't like other things. Then we say, okay, let's try to remove the things you don't like, and let's try to strengthen the things you like, and let's try to invent some new things that will make your communication better. So this approach is a basis not only for describing and explaining what goes on in communication, it can also be the basis for trying to change things, which is what consultants usually are paid to do. So for those of you who have thoughts about going into some kind of consultancy business after you finish your 2 years master, this is a model you could use for that. You can also, for those of you who want to continue to do research, it's also possible to use it. But then you should use more the description and explanation. Okay, it's also possible to use it if you are interested in artificial modeling of dialogue systems or communication systems. And more people are doing that sort of thing today. I don't know, do we have any such people in this class? Any IT people here? One person? Have you done something already?
That's my master in computer networking. Security.
Okay, but that's more like Facebook and Britain, that kind of stuff? Or what is it? Or real computer networking, it's sort of hardware stuff? Okay. So you haven't really looked at the software stuff so much, you're doing that now?
I'm kind of hate it, that's why I'm here.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's actually good to have a hardware basis and then put some more software stuff on top of that. Good. Okay. Yeah. Okay, now we come to well, how we normally analyze social activities. So the idea is that we want to try to understand how communication works within a social activity. When we analyze any social activity, we have these four, which I use different words, sometimes we call them four parameters, sometimes we call them, I don't know, 4 factors, there are many words. The first one is we were trying to find out what the purpose of the activity is. That's the first one. Second one is we're trying to find out the typical roles of the participants in the activity. And the third one is, are there any typical instruments, objects and so on that are used in order to pursue the activity? Like here, for example, we're using this PowerPoint presentation, which is typical of lecturing as an activity. And the typical roles of a lecture are what? Yes? Roles, not interaction type. Exchange is an interaction. Huh?
Sender and receiver?
That's true for all communication. So now we're trying to concentrate on the lecture. Teacher, student would be one way to say it, yes. Lecture, audience, something like that. Okay, so those are the roles, right? What's the purpose of a lecture?
Getting your message across.
Isn't that true for a lot of different types of communication? It's not very specific to lecturing. Increasing knowledge, yeah. That's also true for many types of communication, but perhaps getting closer to lecturing. Anything else? Yes?
Indoctrinating, maybe?
Indoctrinating, especially today. I don't know, but not always. Sometimes, yes. Yeah. Anything else?
Getting lectured.
Huh?
Getting lectured.
Is that the purpose, to get lectures? That's your purpose of being come here. Yeah, okay, so let's say you said it's like presenting some topic within a limited time span in a more or less coherent fashion in such a way that people can understand it, etc., right? And it's usually that term is used in a some kind of educational context. It could be also maybe a public lecture, but usually even there it's some kind of educational context. You're trying to, one person is trying to give you information that you didn't have before, so you learn something new. Something along those lines. And the typical roles then are the lecturer and the audience, and the typical instruments are things like whiteboards, PowerPoint presentations, blackboards, there are many things. Sometimes we include also in these number 3 there, we think about rules, or sometimes we put it in number 1, rules that regulate the whole activity. That's true to some extent for lecture, for example. They're regulated in some cases by rules that the university, in this case, for example, has adopted about lecture.
Number 3.
Or in number 1.
Okay.
Depends a little on how it depends if you see the rules as an instrument for the activity, then it's number 3. If you see them as a goal you're trying to get to, you see them as number 1.
Okay.
And the last thing is just an analysis of the environment, the natural and social environment. So in this case, we would say, okay, so here is a room full of benches and chairs, and you're all sitting this direction, which makes it easy for one person to talk to all of you. And it makes it much harder for you to talk to each other. In order to do that, you have to, like, do what you do, turn around a bit now and then. That requires extra effort. Yeah. So, it's sort of set up making it easy for one person to speak to many. This kind of furnishing a room is the right, you might say, for lecturing. It's not the right if you want group work. Then you should have people sitting in small groups of 3 or 4, whatever you want. Maybe even with their back to the lecturer, which makes it harder for the lecturer to get your attention. Okay, so all of these aspects go together in creating resources for the activity, you might say. So I think we've already talked about this. This approach can be used both for description and for change, more normative approach. It can strengthen good things, remove bad things, and introduce new practices. I think I mentioned that already. And now let me get back to this idea of macro, meso, etc. So actually we have both interests here of moving from large macro units to micro units and moving from micro units to macro units. So if we look at we start from a macro perspective or a more general perspective. One of the points of interest for this kind of analysis is knowledge about human nature. What are we able to do biologically and cognitively? What does our brain permit us to do? What does our vocal organs, our hands, fingers, etc., how can we gesture, how can we move? All of those things are preconditions of what communication can be like. And so there's a lot of research in communication which tries to look at biology and physics and the preconditions of communication in biological and physical terms. And that's part of the interest here too. Then we have culture, an example we just discussed, Swedish culture, or we could take, any other Polish culture we've been talking about here, and whatever, Chinese, etc. And all of these cultures, they of course exert an influence on communication, and when we do courses on intercultural communication, we're interested in that sort of influence. But this course should make you remember that influence actually comes in through an activity. And the lecturing in China is not the same thing as bargaining in the marketplace. You have different behaviors in China when you bargain in the marketplace than if you're sitting in a classroom. Those differences are perhaps bigger between marketplace and classroom than between China and Sweden. Now this is something that sometimes is forgotten in intercultural communication, how large the difference between different activities can be. And you say the Chinese are always like this, but they're not always like this. They are sometimes like this. It depends on what they're doing. So the activity is very important. Then we have the language. Different languages allow for different things. Different languages have different customs. Let's stay with China. You know the Chinese go around saying, when they meet each other, they go around saying, have you eaten? 吃了吗? So it's very strange. Why do they do that? Do we have any Chinese people here? Yeah, why do you say 吃了吗? Just culture. Come up with something more interesting. What?
Don't say that for now.
You stop saying that now?
Yeah.
Some of you have. Some of you still say it, I think.
Especially among young.
Yeah, maybe it's somewhat old-fashioned. What do you say then?
Yo, task.
I believe you. Huh? Say what you say now.
Yo, what's up?
Yeah, what's up, you? What's up? Oh, what's up, dude? Okay, but that surely must also be somewhat limited in its use. Okay, so customs yeah. Okay, but you can see here that customs are different in different countries. So in Sweden we have this strange thing we go around saying, hey, hey. You know, in other cultures you don't say that. So already in the area of greetings we see quite a bit of cultural variation and language variation. So language is part of the preconditions of these activities. We have institutions. So bargaining in the university might not be the same as bargaining, let's say, in a marketplace. The social institution of a university of education is a different kind of institution than, let's say, commercial enterprise. And a particular particular place or a particular type of social institution would then be realized in an organization. So the University of Gothenburg is an organization, and within that within that organization, we could have an activity then like lecturing. So okay, so we have all of these successive layers, which all exert an influence on what we do. And below the social activity, we come to the communicative acts, requesting, claiming, describing, etc. We come to the communicative act roles, lecturer, audience, and we come to the speaker and what we do as speakers and listeners. And finally, we come to the individual speakers. All lecturers are not alike. They are different. And that depends on their personality, let's say. Okay, so we go all the way down, and then we can go up again if you want to. So, now we have to go to the definition of communication as well. And one of the, I think I've already talked about this, that in this approach the idea is that we don't have transfer as much as we have sharing, and that this sharing can take place on different levels of awareness. So we can have more or less subconscious influences, and we can have much more intentional and conscious influences. And this interchange and sharing of information then takes place in this approach mainly within social activities. And when we study a social activity, then we will study within that activity. Sometimes the word practice is used by some people, so we can see the activity as a set of coordinated activities which realize the purpose of the activities. The practice can also be seen in that way. Okay, I can see that some of you have been moving out of the classroom, and I thought I could go on without the pause, but I think you probably need it. There are so many influences on any one of us. We have, we have language, culture, organization, etc. Things like gender, male, female, age, a lot of things. Means that any communication is multi-causal. There are many influences on us. We can look at all of these factors as influences, but we could also look at them as resources that we can use. So the fact that I have a certain cultural background, that I have a certain age, etc., I can use that in communicating as a resource. But it's also something that's going to influence what I do. So influence and resource are two words that can apply to the same thing. It depends on what perspective you take on it. So, yeah, you see there, we all have a culture, we have an age, one or several cultures perhaps. Age, we have a gender, we have an occupation, and we have an activity role. And all these things come together and put some pressure on what we do when we communicate. That might, for example, be true of something we have studied quite a bit here, namely talk between patients and doctors. So there we have, let's say we have the doctor role and the patient role, but we might also then have a special kind of activity, namely, I don't know what, giving a diagnosis. And the doctor is the person who is the diagnoser, and the patient is the person receiving the diagnosis. So we can put all of these different influences together, and the focus here, as I've said several times, is the social activity. Now, when we get into studying what happens within the social activity, we also need to have some kind of framework to study the communication. And so now we start to look at how we can analyze the gestures and the talk that people produce when they communicate with each other. In this model, there is a two-way division between main message and communicative management. Main message is the main message that is being shared. Communicative management is the way in which I manage my interaction with you and I manage my own interaction. So we have two types of communicative management. Interactive communicative management and own communicative management. Sometimes I also say own communication management. Communicative or communication, it's the same thing. We have two types of own communication management. One type has to do with having time enough to plan what you're going to say. I call that choice because it has to do with choice of words, choice of constructions, choice of topic, what you want to talk about and how you should talk about it. The other kind called change. That has to do with noticing that maybe I didn't say this the right way. Maybe I have to say it once more. Maybe I have to say it in a different way. And I have to make that change in a way that makes it possible for you to follow what I'm doing. So those are change and choice mechanisms. Interactive communication management has to do with how we regulate who is the main communicator, what we call turn management, how we regulate in which order we do things, we call this sequencing, how we regulate, how we let other people know if we have understood, if we can hear what they say or we cannot hear what they say, we cannot understand what they say, how we react to what they're saying emotionally. So all those things are feedback. Then sometimes we look at the rhythm of the whole thing. What decides how quickly things move on, how slow they move on. And then we look at the spatial orientation. How are people orienting to each other? That can sometimes be strongly influenced by the way a room is furnished. So for example, as I discussed before, you don't have very many choices. You have to look forward. Or you don't have to, but you can sit like this, but it's easier for you to look forward. So you can see how such a thing as spatial orientation can be decided by the environmental factors of the activity. So in general, the idea is to look at how different properties of the activity decide these things. The main message and the communication management factors. That's the whole game, really. The influence between the activity factors and the properties, the features of the communication that we see here. Okay, and the last line more or less reminds us that a lot of these things are done multimodally. So they are done both with vocal words, like I'm speaking now, but look at my hands. Why am I doing this? So it's also with gestures and words together, multimodal. Or it could be touch in some cases, yeah?
That is, in your case, language always included? Because I'm thinking on the grocery store right now, and I see interactive communication management, and for example, the spatial orientation, how they build, how they guide people through their store, how they include music and maybe smells, for example.
Yeah.
It's kind of an activity communication, but language isn't necessarily included. Maybe through a speaker.
Okay, you asked several questions. Is language always included? Yes, language is always included, but it doesn't mean that it necessarily has to exclude everything else. So if you want to include music as part of what is being used to communicate, that is possible. It's not the focus here, but it would be possible. Smell, well, basically we have 5 senses. Taste, smell, touch, that could be included in multimodal communication, sure. Now, of course, the smell might be external to actually the community. I mean, it could be something added on top of it to I don't know, get people to move in a certain direction in the store. That you could include, that's not the focus here, but that would be like the music, adding a certain feature to the total communication output, which is being shared. You should write a paper on this. This would be very good, actually, to show how we could include music and smell. Come back to me. I find that's very interesting. I mean, how would we do that in this model? That's not been it's not excluded by this, but it's not the focus of this model. Focus here is face-to-face communication between two persons. It's not listening to loudspeakers in a store. Which, it would be possible to analyze that too, but that hasn't been the focus. Yeah, good question. Okay. How does communication work within social activities? An example. So, have you seen this example before? I think you have. You think back, let's ask our memory specialist here. Have you seen this before? He's smiling? No. Well, I think you have. Anybody remember it?
Yeah.
Yes? You were surprised. Okay, so if you remember, C1 here is actually a customer, that's why C, and that person is entering a travel agency, and that person is trying to call the attention of the agent. So the person said, "Whoop," okay, and then the agent says, "Oh," which, and in CA terminology, they would call this a summons, I think. So the hook is a summons, call for attention, and the is feedback, you might say. It's acknowledgement, giving an acknowledgement. I will attend to you. I'm listening. Okay, and then C, the customer says, and what's that? That's own communication management. He's trying to gain time to plan, to see, to find the words. You want to say something?
For the choice.
For choice, yeah. Yeah, choice of words. So then after this, and the two parallel slashes there, I mean small pause in time. So then it says flights to Paris. Now, in linguistic terminology, this is a noun phrase. But actually here, it's a request. It's a request for information. This person steps up, flights to Paris. How are you supposed to understand that? Well, you probably understand it as...
You want to fly to Paris, and I should give you a ticket.
Yeah, that's one way. And if you take a slightly milder interpretation, it could be, you're interested in flying to Paris and I should give you information.
Ah, okay.
That's slightly milder. Then I haven't really said I want the ticket yet. I might just want to know a little about it.
Is it context? Because you're not.
Of course, it's in your interest that I should buy a ticket. So you try to get me to do that, but you know, it's possible to have a slightly milder. Okay. Ska du ha en returbiljett? Again? That is actually a combination of interactive communication management and own communication management, right? Because shows I hear you, I got what you said, and giving an answer, but it also gives me short time there to plan what I'm going to say. So it's a combination of own and interactive communication management. Do you want a return ticket? But that's interactive communication management, more than own communication management. It's showing I couldn't hear. You know, I'm thinking, what am I hearing? So, then the utterance becomes, what did you say? So it actually doesn't hear. So this is negative feedback. First, you might say that the in fact, also is a kind of combination between interactive and own communication management. But the Causal then shows that actually it's more interactive. So I couldn't hear what you said. Or, of course, it could mean I couldn't hear what you said, but I didn't really understand what you said. So sometimes it's hard to know if what did you say means I didn't hear you or I didn't understand you. It could even in some cases mean, I'm not sure it does in this case, but it could mean I'm very surprised at what you're saying. What did you say? Of course, I hear what you say, but I'm very surprised. Depends on the tone of voice with which you say this thing. Okay, so if we look at now these activity factors, the purpose, the roles, artifacts, we have here an analysis of these things. So the goal of the travel bureau interaction is to give information about traveling, destinations, waste time, prices, hotels, and also maybe possibilities of booking tickets, hotels, cars, whatever. And when we do this analysis, we will break down the roles into competence, obligations, rights. So we'll do the competence of the travel agent, and we'll do the competence of the customer. We'll do the obligations of the travel agent and of the customer, and the rights of the agent and the customer. So, what is the competence requirement? Well, if you're an agent, you should know how to find information about flights to Paris, and you should know how to book a flight to Paris. If you're a customer, the only requirement really here is that you should have an interest in this. That's why you go in, so that's a mild requirement. Obligation. If you're an agent, you're paid a salary to show customers or to give customers that information, that service. If they want to book a ticket, then you should be able to do that for them. If you are not able to do that, you should probably be fired. So you will be punished. So that's your job. Okay, customer. Well, obligation is to come in there, do something relevant to the travel agency in a fairly polite way. If you do this in an impolite way, the agent might have reason to throw you out. Maybe this should be done also in a polite way, but you know, there is a kind of politeness requirement in many activities, including this one. And here culture comes in. Politeness is different in different cultures. Rights, well, the agent has a right to relevant and polite communication from the customer. And the customer has a right to relevant, polite answers from the agent. What artifacts or instruments do they have in doing this? Well, when the customer comes in, the agent is sitting in front of a computer and writing. That's why we needed the hub to get the agent's attention. So, he also has a telephone, and so he's using all this. Face-to-face communication, talking on the telephone, writing on the computer, and these are all things that come in and help as resources or influences. Both these perspectives are always relevant on the activity. And the environment is a travel agency, and there's a counter where the customer stands on one side, the agent is on another side. I think you can all see. So that is what these activity parameters give you. They give you influencing, or if you like, resources to pursue the activity. And you then do the analysis of the activity in terms of the main messages, of the turns or contributions, and the communication management features as well. Okay, so if we want to speculate a little about the effects here on the communication of these factors, well, we saw here that the customer came in, he needed to open the dialogue, so he did this by saying the word hop. And then what you would expect from a customer in a travel agency is to have an inquiry about destinations, ways of traveling, booking, that's what you would expect. If that for some reason doesn't work, the customer has to be prepared to have alternative ways of stating what he wants from the agent. And the customer also has to be prepared to answer the agent's questions, because of course the agent very often will need to know more information from the customer in order to help the customer. The agent perhaps needs to know, when do you want to go? Are you going in tomorrow? Or are you going in 6 months from now? Do you want to go by bus? Or do you want to go by aeroplane? Do you want a return ticket, or do you want a single? So there are lots of things here. Do you want business class, or do you want to? So a lot of questions of this type, customer has to be prepared to answer. The agent has, of course, to be able to give answers to the customer's questions, and to give, well, sometimes this is not so easy. So then the agent has to give reports about why it's not possible to give an answer, or when an answer could be given, etc. And the agent has to know what kind of more specific information he or she needs from the customer. So you ask additional questions in order to help the customer. A very special thing that might come up sometimes is if the telephone rings while you are talking to this person in front of you. How should you deal with that? When your employer wants you to make money on the guy in front of you, but your employer also wants you to make money on the person who's calling. How can you satisfy two people at the same time? Well, you have to learn that. That's part of being a travel agent. To do that in a polite way so that both customers are satisfied. In this particular recording that I started to show you, this situation happens. And one can study how this particular agent deals with that problem. Then you have the problem of, let's say there are other people behind this person, and you want to move on. You know, they all want service. How are you going to stop? This guy says, yeah, but you know, in Paris there's the Eiffel Tower, I thought I would go there, and then there's the Louvre, and here's the agent sitting. There's people behind you. Should you say that? No. How can he get this person to stop talking? How can he get this person to be satisfied and throw him out at the same time? Not easy. So these are some of the sort of everyday challenges, which sometimes generate a requirement of creativity. So Arvid is going to talk to you about how you have to be creative in these activities, how you have to find new solutions sometimes to solve the problems that come up in the activity. And sometimes these solutions are standardized and conventional, sometimes they're more new, to think of some new ways of doing it. Okay, so these are all kind of things that we do when we do this kind of activity-based analysis. Beginning to get the idea of this? Yes. Yeah. Good. So, what we then study are these things that you've seen. Turn-taking, feedback, sequences, forms of address. We didn't talk about that. How should the agent address the customer? Should he say monsieur? In France, maybe he should. In Sweden, herr? No, not nowadays. So different cultures have different requirements here. How polite should you be? What titles should you use? Very big cultural differences on this point. What can you expect from a travel agent? What types of speech acts? What communicative functions? When you ask questions of the customer, how should you ask them? With one word. So should the agent say to the customer, return? That just means return. I mean, that's one way of asking a question. Do you want to return? Or should they say, vill du ha en returbiljett? Which is a longer way. Okay, all of these things come up. They have to do with many things. It could be time pressure, it could be different things. Okay, what are the important concepts and terms in these activities? For traveling, that's probably destinations, means of transport, etc. But there are many other kinds of activities. Patient, doctor, other terms. Sicknesses, medicines, treatments, etc. Types of grammatical constructions. In a travel agency, we would guess that ways of asking for information, giving information that has been asked for, the kind of grammatical constructions that make that possible are important. Now, here you must, of course, be open to what some linguists perhaps could not have told you if they didn't look at these dialogues. They would have said, okay, so we expect questions, interrogative sentences. But as you saw yourself now, people don't ask questions with interrogative sentences always. They sometimes ask questions just with single words. That's not what you would usually expect from a traditional linguistic analysis. Okay. Distribution of verbal space between the participants. That's often a sign of power and influence. The person who talks most has more power. Usually. Not always, but quite often. So how is this distribution of who says what? Word richness, vocabulary richness. Who talks most? Who has what kind of words? What kind of words belong to one role and to the other role? This could show something about the knowledge or the insight of the different participants in the activity. Could also look at things like how many pauses are there? Do the pauses in one person's contributions, are there more pauses in one person's contributions than in another's? Are there more overlaps in one type of activity than another activity? Emphatic stress. When I'm talking, I'm putting emphatic stress on a lot of words to make you hear. So that could be typical of a lecture. But is it typical of a travel agency? I don't know. You're shaking your head. Yeah. It's dangerous to shake your head. You should look at the data. Sometimes you get surprises. You know, people do things you don't always expect them to do. Liveliness. You can define fairly abstract concepts. Is one activity livelier than another? What is meant by liveliness? So you could say, okay, liveliness. We have liveliness when people interrupt each other a lot, when they talk with a loud voice now and then. You could name a number of properties of this type. And then you could just see if those properties were present in the data. And then you could say, on the basis of that this activity is more lively than that. And when people ask you, what do you mean by liveliness? You'll say, I'll tell you, here's my list. This is what it is. Okay, I'm sorry, I don't think I have time to tell you very much more, but I think you've got the basic idea now. Yep. Thank you.